press conference. And our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, is also in Brussels. Very busy day, Sam. What is the latest?
Well, we're waiting, as you say, to find out what was concluded by the 30 or so NATO leaders who've been meeting this morning. Boris Johnson opposite President Macron of France, Joe Biden of the US and Olaf Scholz of Germany, to find out whether or not the NATO alliance is delivering what President Zelenskyy asked for in that passionate address that you heard some of just now. Now, what Zelenskyy said was quite important. He didn't reiterate that call, we understand, for a no-fly zone. Instead, he asked for very specific equipment. 1% of your planes, 1% of your tanks is what he asked for in a video address with the NATO leaders. Now, Boris Johnson told us this morning that Britain is already stepping up to the plate. 6,000 more weapons, just under £100 million additional aid for Ukraine. And he very much, having spoken to President Zelenskyy only yesterday, wants to put the pressure on other Western leaders to do more. Some Western leaders more reluctant than others, particularly when it comes to sanctions. Boris Johnson making clear today that he's going after the, as it were, militia army of President Putin, the Wagner Group. Now, they are thought to be the individuals, the military force going after President Zelenskyy personally. Boris Johnson will call on other world leaders to increase their sanctions as well. Has it worked? Well, that's exactly what we're hoping to find out about when we get to the press conference led by Jens Stoltenberg, the UN, the NATO Secretary General, which should be starting anytime soon.
And we will go to it live when it does begin. Sam Coates, for now, thank you so much. Let's go to Ukraine and speak to Sky's Sally Lockwood, who's in Lviv, in the west of the country. And Sally, many ears there, no doubt, will be listening in to what NATO has to announce any minute now.
Well, I think in the West, one assumes that that may be the case, but certainly from some of the refugees that we've spoken to here at Lviv train station in western Ukraine, they have far bigger things to worry about. We've just spoken to a family who've arrived here from the southern city of Mariupol, which of course has been devastated in the last few weeks. 3 generations of women from one family, a grandmother, a mother and a granddaughter. They are absolutely exhausted. We're talking about people who've been without power, without food largely for weeks now, and a lot of them have been without internet. It's not until they've got here, they've got outside of Mariupol and managed to get to somewhere safe, that they've even been able to understand the sort of thing that's going on, that the capital Kiev hasn't fallen as so many assumed would happen at the beginning of this war. And so I think the diplomacy that's going on in Brussels today, while hugely important, we're talking about a country that's been through immense trauma in the last month. A quarter of the country have been made homeless, and certainly I think right now survival is their primary concern. We also spoke to a family from Kherson, a city in the north of Ukraine, a mother who's arrived here with her 3 children. And she did say, though, that she would like to see more Western support in terms of closing the skies over Ukraine, as people have come to describe it, that no-fly zone that President Zelenskyy has called on NATO to impose time and time again. And why is that? Well, while the ground offensive may have stalled here by Russian troops, it's certainly failed in many areas. It's not been the ground offensive that President Putin, I'm sure, imagined. Russian forces haven't even made it inside the capital Kiev yet, and indeed in some areas Ukrainian forces have actually retaken ground. But airstrikes are what is concerning people the most here in Ukraine now. You just need to look at that southern city of Mariupol, which has been absolutely devastated, a humanitarian disaster unfolding in the south of the country there. The bombings described as war crimes. But one thing that I should also mention is that we haven't yet had an air raid siren today, and I don't believe we had one last night either. the train station here in Lviv, in western Ukraine, which has seen tens of thousands of families passing through it in search of safety in recent weeks, is far quieter today. There certainly seems to be perhaps less panic in Ukraine. Perhaps they've seen that the Russian advance has stalled, has failed. There is certainly a sense of confidence here, despite the chaos, despite the trauma, and all these millions of people who've been made homeless by this war. There is a sense of confidence that Ukraine will come through this. The big question is, at what cost?
Sally Lockwood, thank you so much. A senior Russian diplomat has told Sky News that Russia retains the right to use nuclear weapons if provoked by NATO. Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, also said the country was not committing war crimes in Ukraine despite the mounting evidence. Here's our US correspondent, Martha Kellner.
This is one of very few places left in New York where this man would still be welcome. It's here at the Russian mission to the UN, where its leading diplomats write their speeches, where they work out how on earth to defend the indefensible.
Vladimir Putin's personal spokesperson said that Russia retains the right to use nuclear weapons to defend the country, whatever that may be, from whatever invented
If Russia is provoked by NATO, if Russia is attacked by NATO, I don't know. So we are nuclear power. Why not?
You think that's a legitimate thing to be saying, though?
I don't think it's the right thing to be saying, but it's not the right thing to threaten Russia and to try to interfere. So when you're dealing with a nuclear power, of course you have to calculate all the possible outcomes of your behavior. That's what I'm going to say.
But is Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine?
I don't think we're committing war crimes in Ukraine. Of course, it's not up to me to assess. I'm not there, you're not there. You're looking at the videos, you're looking at the many of videos who are considered to be fake news.
Are you saying that the civilian homes, playgrounds, hospitals, theatres have not been targeted by Russia in Mariupol?
They were not targeted. And you know it very well. We said from the very beginning that our military is not the threat for civilian population in Ukraine.
Can I show you what the US believes is evidence of war crimes? These are pictures taken by our colleagues at Associated Press, independent news site. These are apartments on fire in Mariupol, hit by Russian missiles.
How do you know it's Russian missiles? Because there is a self-defense.
What is your suggestion that the Ukrainians are bombing?
I will tell you.
Their own building?
It can easily come from Ukraine, from the center of the city. It happened in Kharkov. It happened in Mariupol, because they have their own missile launchers, and a lot of cases that I know are reported from Ukrainian missiles themselves.
Ambassador, with respect, I think that's preposterous.
I don't know.
The idea that this amount of destruction.
I think it's quite logical. It's not preposterous.
Maybe.
Mr. Polyansky may not believe Russia is guilty of war crimes, but the US says they are. The International Criminal Court will ultimately decide. But with every wild claim being made by its diplomats, Russia becomes increasingly isolated on the world stage. Martha Kellner, Sky News, New York.
Martha Kellner there. Let's get the latest analysis of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. General Sir Richard Barrons joins me now. General Sir Richard, very good afternoon to you. And of course, NATO are meeting as we speak. So we just wanted to start with a little snapshot here of the the NATO members in blue, and just ask the question, what's probably top of the agenda in the discussions that they've been having over the last few hours?
So this is an emergency meeting to talk about Ukraine, and there are two important dimensions to this conversation. The most important in the longer term is how NATO now remobilises itself to deal with Russia under President Putin in a way that is the most significant change since the end of the Cold War in 1990. And the second thing they're going to do, just as important, is talk about NATO support to Ukraine in terms of more sanctions and military support.
On the topic of military support, if we just dive in a little bit closer, but still with the NATO neighbours clearly in shot, some announcements that have started to come out, some that are expected in terms of reinforcements?
Yes, so NATO is going to affirm today it's going to deploy 4 more battle groups. It has battle groups already deployed across NATO, one each to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and they're a sign of NATO assurance and a signal that Article 5 remains inviolate.
And now let's dive in a little bit to get some perspectives of what's going on the ground in Ukraine. First of all, a focus dive on Kiev itself. And we have heard relatively encouraging stories of some successful counterattacks by Ukrainian forces in and around Kiev. Are those significant, General Sir Richard?
So they are significant, but they're very small scale. So we know of successful Ukrainian counterattacks, for example, in Irpin and Bucha, and also actually to the east of Kiev. And these are very small tactical actions, but they are indicative of the Russian forces are not breaking into Kiev, and indeed in many places are moving back a little and starting to build defensive positions. And that feels like another signal of this evolving stalemate.
Let's talk about that stalemate if we zoom out and look at all of Ukraine. We've been talking that these red-shaded areas, the land that Russia has seized, haven't changed drastically over the last week, the fourth week of this war. The stalemate, is that a very good thing for Ukraine, or does it give Russia time to refuel, both literally and metaphorically?
Well, both of those things are true, I think. I think the signs are right now that the Russian campaign in its current construction is not capable of taking much more ground, and we're beginning to see Russia dig in these defensive positions, which would indicate that it realises that. That does not mean that will be the outcome, because Russia is moving reinforcements from across Russia, both men and material, in order to unlock that stalemate. But we're seeing not much movement around Kiev. We're seeing the battle for Mariupol, which we imagine they will in the end break. We have not seen the significant movement towards Odessa that we were forecasting a week ago, but we couldn't rule it out. And we are concerned about Russian forces moving from the north and the south of the country once Mariupol is concluded, in order to try and circle the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass. But what this begins to feel like is a war confined to the east of Ukraine, except for continuing air and missile attacks in the west on the supply lines. But this is not the war Russia intended to have.
General Sir Richard Barons, thanks so much for that summary of what's going on the ground on this fourth week of the war. The Ukrainian government says 7 humanitarian corridors have been agreed today, but there's still no safe passage out of the city of Mariupol. Tens of thousands of people are trapped there without food, water or medicine, and life is extremely difficult. Our correspondent Sally Lockwood spoke to one mother who has managed to escape.
The city of Mariupol is almost totally destroyed. In its ashes are at least 100,000 people trapped and trying to stay alive. But it's feared there could be far more than that.
Let's interrupt that and go live now to Brussels, that NATO press conference with Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg starting now.
Good afternoon. We have just finished an extraordinary summit of NATO leaders to address the biggest threat to our security in a generation: President Putin's war against Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are resisting with courage and determination, fighting for their freedom and for their future. We stand with them. President Zelenskyy addressed us with an impassioned message, thanking NATO allies for the significant support we are providing, and stressing the vital importance of even more military assistance. Today, NATO leaders agreed that we must and will provide further support to Ukraine. We will continue to impose unprecedented costs on Russia, and we will reinforce allied deterrence and defense. Leaders approved our 4 new battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia. These are in addition to the 4 already in the Baltic countries and Poland. So we have 8 multinational NATO battle groups now, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Across Europe, there are 100,000 US troops supporting NATO efforts, and European allies and Canada have also stepped up. We have 40,000 forces under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, backed by major air and naval power. including an unprecedented 5 carrier strike groups from the high north to the Mediterranean. Today, NATO leaders agreed to reset our deterrence and defence for the longer term, to face a new security reality. On land, we will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, we will deploy more jets and strengthen our integrated air and missile defense. At sea, we will have carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on a persistent basis. We will also strengthen our cyber defenses and enhance our exercises, focusing on collective defense and interoperability. I expect we will decide on the details at our next summit in Madrid in June. Today, Allied leaders also agreed to provide further support to Ukraine, helping to uphold their fundamental right to self-defense. Allies are also equipping Ukraine with significant military supplies, including anti-tank and air defense systems and drones, which are proving highly effective, as well as substantial financial and humanitarian aid. Today, we agreed to do more, including cyber security assistance and equipment to help Ukraine protect against biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear threats. This could include detection, protection, and medical supplies, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are determined to do all we can to support Ukraine, and I welcome the concrete offers of assistance made by allies today. At the same time, we have a responsibility to ensure the conflict does not escalate further, because this would be even more dangerous and more devastating. Allies agreed that we must also increase our support for other partners at risk from Russia at risk from Russian threats and interference, including Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Working together and with the European Union, we must help them uphold their sovereignty and strengthen their resilience. We also addressed Beijing's role in the crisis. Today, Allied leaders called on China to refrain from supporting Russia's war effort. China must not provide economic or military support for the Russian invasion. Instead, Beijing should use its significant influence on Russia and promote an immediate peaceful resolution. Allies also agree that Belarus must stop acting as an accomplice to Putin's invasion. At today's meeting, leaders reaffirmed our strong commitment to NATO's open door policy under Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. NATO enlargement has been an historic success, spreading democracy, freedom and prosperity across Europe. 1 month since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's security environment has fundamentally changed for the long haul, and we are responding. But security does not come for free, and doing more will cost more. So NATO leaders agreed to redouble efforts to meet the defence investment pledge we made in 2014. Allies will submit additional plans on how to meet the pledge in time for the Madrid summit in June. And I welcome that a number of allies today announced plans for significant increases in defence spending. At this dangerous time, transatlantic unity and solidarity are vital. Europe and North America are standing and will continue to stand strong together in NATO. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, CNN.
Hi, Mr. Secretary General, thank you. President Zelenskyy, in his address to NATO, accused Russia of deploying phosphorus munitions. I'm wondering whether NATO has seen evidence of that and what your response is or would be. And then I'm wondering, did you discuss during this meeting a permanent basing of forces in any of these countries, such as the Baltics, and abandoning the NATO-Russia Founding Act?
So we are resetting NATO's deterrence and defense for the long term, with more troops, with more air assets and more maritime capabilities. We have already increased our presence in the East, and today we decided on 4 new battle groups, and the leaders agreed to task our military commanders to provide options for a long-term reset of our presence, our military posture in the eastern part of the alliance and across the whole alliance. Details will be then decided at our summit in June. But that comes on top of what we have already done. So this is long-term. We are prepared for long haul because we can already today say that the Russian invasion, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has changed our security environment for the long term. It's a new reality. It's a new normal, and NATO is responding for the long term. We have seen very credible reports about the use of military force against civilians, and of course this is of great concern for all NATO allies.
NBC.
Secretary General, thank you for taking my question. How do you believe NATO will respond if China begins to support Russia economically and perhaps with military supplies? And also, do you believe that there's a role to play for NATO when it comes to alleviating energy costs? And I'm talking about speaking directly to Saudi Arabia and other OPEC producers. Thank you.
So NATO allies are coordinating their efforts when it comes to also energy security, and it was also addressed in the meeting today to step up supplies, to diversify sources of supply, and also to reduce dependence on supplies from Russia. And later on today, I also participate in the G7 meeting, and of course, in different frameworks, G7 working with the EU, there are different formats where NATO allies address the need to strengthen energy security and reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas. Our message to China is that they should join the rest of the world and clearly condemn the brutal war against Ukraine and not support Russia, neither with economic support or, of course, not with military support.
Okay, we'll go to Interfax Ukraine, lady in the second row. Yeah.
General News Agency Interfax Ukraine. I would like to ask you if Polish leadership put at the table today for discussion the proposal to send peacekeeping mission to Ukraine, and if yes, what kind of discussion it was, and is there some conclusion? Thank you.
As we discussed a wide range of issues, and the message is that we have to stand united. And also that we need to provide support to Ukraine, but at the same time we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict do not become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And that's also the reason why allies have made it clear that we will not deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine, because the only way to do that is to be prepared to engage in full conflict with Russian troops.
Okay, Financial Times.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Congratulations on your annual extension. You said in the statement that allies agreed to enhance preparedness and readiness for chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. Is that based on credible intelligence that those threats could be imminent? And how does the alliance strengthen its protection against those threats? Thank you.
So we are concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false. Any use of chemical weapons will totally change the nature of the conflict. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have widespread consequences and, of course, be extremely dangerous. It will affect the people in Ukraine, but there's also a risk that will have a direct effect on people living in NATO countries, because we can see contamination, we can see the spread of chemical agents or biological weapons into our countries. We also know that Russia has used chemical agents against its own opposition, and they have used it on NATO territory in Salisbury before. And we also know that Russia has facilitated, supported the Assad regime in Syria when they used chemical weapons against their own population. So this just highlights the importance of ending this war immediately, because this is a dangerous situation. And therefore we impose the sanctions, therefore we support Ukraine. Allies agreed to supply equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. This could include detection equipment, protection and medical support, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are also enhancing allies' preparedness and readiness for chemical and biological and nuclear threats. Our top military commander, General Walters, has activated NATO's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense elements, and allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups. So we are taking measures both to support Ukraine and also to defend ourselves.
Okay, we'll go to Al Jazeera.
Secretary General James Bays from Al Jazeera. President Zelenskyy, when he addressed you, recalled the fact he first spoke to you a month ago, and he says he didn't get clear answers. So this time he asked you specifically for 1% of all your tanks, for 1% of all your aircraft, for multi-launch rocket systems, anti-ship weapons and means of air defence. A very specific list. What is your clear answer?
We all listened very carefully to President Zelenskyy, and many of the leaders in the room have had contacts with him over these weeks. I also spoke with him, and the Ukrainian defense minister participated in our defense ministerial meeting last week. We listened carefully, and of course we took note of his very compassionate message to all NATO allies. NATO allies provide significant support to Ukraine. And we provide also lethal weapons, advanced systems, and also systems that help them to shoot down planes and attack battle tanks with anti-tank weapons and many other types of systems, including drones. I will not go into the details of the exact type of systems we are deploying. There is close contact between NATO allies and Ukraine. But what I can say is that allies do what they can to support Ukraine with weapons so Ukraine can defend themselves. Self-defense is a right enshrined in the UN Charter. At the same time, we have a responsibility to prevent this conflict from becoming a full-fledged war in Europe involving not only Ukraine and Russia, but NATO allies and Russia. That will be more dangerous and more devastating. And I think we have to be honest about that, and that's exactly what we have been in our meeting today, and also what I say to you in the press conference now. Well, what we do is that we are delivering a lot of equipment, and that is an answer. But I will not go into the details. I don't think that's wise for operational reasons if I listed exactly what and when and how. We are delivering essential equipment to Ukraine. NATO allies have stepped up, and it's essential for the progress they have been able to make in the fight against the invading Russian forces.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I know there are many questions. I'm afraid the Secretary General needs to go to the G7 meeting, but there will be other briefings throughout the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. Let's just sum up some of the key points he just made. First and foremost, he said at the top, we stand with Ukraine. He said that the NATO members in their meeting just now had agreed that they must provide further support to Ukraine and, of course, touched on that point that we were discussing earlier in the show, that the leaders have now approved those 4 new battle groups to be stationed in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and did mention there that this wasn't just temporary, aiming to reset NATO's defence and security position for the long term. So there's about 100,000 NATO troops across Europe right now, and mentioned that various individual member states of NATO are adding their own further help during that. By the way, I should also just mention that we've just had a statement from President Biden that was released during that press conference. One line that stands out on that is that NATO is as strong and united as it has ever been. He outlines the aid to Ukraine, the defensive aid to Ukraine that the US has been involved in, more than $1 billion in new security assistance, he says, anti-aircraft systems, anti-armor weapons, drones, and millions of rounds of ammunition. That, of course, over the course of the last month, not a new $1 billion announced today. And he says he welcomes the steps by many other allies to provide defensive support to Ukraine. And together, we, NATO, are committed to identifying additional equipment, including air defense systems, to help Ukraine. He, like Jens Stoltenberg just then, also mentioned further announcements expected and that they're planning towards ahead of the next NATO summit in June. Just going back to some of the comments from Jens Stoltenberg, he also said they have seen credible reports of military force against civilians in Ukraine, and concerned by some of Russia's rhetoric that suggests they might be preparing to use chemical weapons. He made clear that any Russian claims or accusations that the West or Ukraine have been using chemical weapons themselves are totally false. He did say that any use by Russia of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of this war. He mentioned the risk that those types of weapons could affect NATO countries, given the potential way that they might spread across borders. And he said he knows that Russia has used those sorts of weapons in the past. That was that press conference from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, just wrapped up moments ago, alongside some comments from President Biden. Of course, the NATO meetings may have started to wrap up. We still have a G7 meeting, we still have an EU meeting, so lots more going on the ground there in Brussels throughout the rest of this day. One of the first Ukrainian refugees to be matched with a family in England under the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme is spending her first day in Bedfordshire.